Good. So it's telling us we're live. I'm just going to get into the group here, Holly, and then just say hi to everybody. So hi everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. We've got a real treat today. I will need to turn my thing down there. If you see me looking over here, I'm just checking in on the thingy. So we've got a real treat today, everybody. We've got Dr Holly Tett here to join us today to talk about trauma and other things. We're going to talk about things in the round. Holly's has a background as a certified clinical psychologist who has now shifted all that experience and skill set and knowledge into working with dogs and carers. So we've spoken before, haven't we, Holly, on a couple of occasions, and it's always been really interesting. So to share this conversation with the group today is a real joy. So welcome to the group, Holly.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We had a chat as part of your conference as well, which it was an amazing event actually, and I think it reached a lot of people there. We'll talk about that in a little while, but Holly, I always like to start off before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty stuff, asking guests a little bit about their journey and their story, and yours is a really interesting one because it's gone through its own kind of stages to where you've got to now. So share with us a little bit about how Holly ended up moving from being working with humans to working with dogs, and where that story was founded.
Yeah, so it's one of those things. It's funny now. I look back and I think, what was I doing? Because clearly I should have been working with dogs forever. But actually, obviously, a large part of what we do, a huge part, is working with people as well. And so I did all the things. When you train to be a psychologist, it's a very long journey, so much you have to get experience and do all these courses and all the rest of it. And when I finally qualified, I actually ended up doing the thing that I'd done all of the experience in. So you have, when you're training, you do sort of placements in all these different types of psychology. And I ended up coming back to working with a forensic population, so working with people that have committed crimes and would have been in prison, but they're unwell, they're in hospital instead. So I worked there for many, many years, and honestly absolutely loved the job. And we were just saying before we jumped on that it's really relevant to this conversation about trauma, because I think a societal view of offenders, if we want to give people that term, is that they're either someone that's done a bad thing or they're bad people. And actually getting to know these people, where they were living 24 hours a day in hospital, coming on a morning shift, or sitting and talking to someone at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're people just like you and I, and a lot of what they'd gone through was really quite harrowing trauma. And you can start to think, oh yeah, okay, I can totally see how you ended up where you ended up because of all these things that happened to you. So it was that thing that we often hear in human psychology, where it's like, don't ask what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And I think that's so relevant for dogs as well. You're not a problem dog. There's not an issue with you. Just something's happened, or several things have happened, and that's why you're behaving as you are, if that makes sense. And then for me personally, I was actually really enjoying my job, but I started my dog business on the side, and I was like, oh, it's so exciting. I get to come home from work and do a puppy class or go work with someone at their house. I was thinking, how can I fit these two things together? And then unfortunately, where I was working, I ended up having quite an unpleasant situation, which in itself was quite traumatic. And I was bullied essentially by my boss. And I thought, you know what? Actually, let me just stop this for now. I'm going to put this on pause. I'm going to move over to work exclusively with dogs and people. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is where I should always have been. So yeah, that's where we've stayed basically. But obviously I try and use a lot of what I know from human psychology with dogs and people as well.
I think that's really interesting, and especially there's so many crossovers there, isn't there, Holly? Because one of the things I talk about in my workshop that I do is just challenging that good to bad continuum of that we look at behavior more widely in society, and we've kind of adopted that a little bit with dogs. We're thinking, oh, that behavior is good, that behavior is bad, and we start falling into that trap of looking at the arbitrary changing of behavior. And of course, even through the legal system, we have the penal side of the system which deals with that. But ultimately, if we really want to try and help people to not be in that place, we have to understand their story, and it's the same for a dog, isn't it? I think that's the thing. There's a lot of crossovers there with how society judges behavior, and especially with some of the more severe behaviors with dogs, you know, the ones that might involve biting or growling or whatever else.
Yeah, Definitely. And it's so interesting because I think people always will look at a spectrum and they'll make a decision at what tipping point is this a bad dog or a bad person, and at what point is this, you know, just something that's happened. Whereas I like to think the actual whole scale is something that's happened to that dog or that person, or several things. And that way it kind of allows us to be more compassionate and to actually draw comparisons, because often we say, oh, you know, we can't say that animals are as people. And I do believe that we are very different. We're a different species, but we both have, as you always say, an emotional experience. And what will be the emotional experience of one animal or one person is going to be very different from someone else. So you could have two dogs from the same litter that went to two sisters, let's say, and they brought them up very similarly, and then you get to two and you've got two very different dogs. So of course you do. They might have some similar genetics, but actually life happens, and those two experiences are never going to be identical. So it's nice to kind of have that overarching view of it, I think, so we can be a bit more compassionate to ourselves and to our dogs as well. Yeah.
That's important, because I framed it before that actually there's two types of behavior: the behavior we judge in others, and understanding where that judgment comes from, and recognizing that that judgment may not, and is possibly not, the emotional truth of the other. It's more just what we see.
Yeah.
And then also the behavior we do ourselves. And that bit is, we can recognize the complexities there actually for behavior, and the multifactorial reasons why we may or may not do something, and how that shifts and changes. And this is the thing about the emotional experience for me, because what this period in the community, what we've got now, this kind of new landscape that's kind of opening up with us, is about is how we can become better being available to the truths of the dogs, and equally the caregivers, actually, because we discussed off air that often the caregiver's journey is just as fraught and just as filled with challenges and potentially trauma in that process of looking after their dog.
Definitely. And I meant to say at the beginning, actually, just a little trigger warning for anyone who is watching, that whenever we are talking about trauma or traumatic experiences, it may be that it brings up something in you. So if that is the case and you have been through some trauma, either recently or in the past, just be aware of that, I suppose, and look after yourself. But yeah, absolutely. And I think a question I often ask people when I'm working with them is, yes, your dog is triggered, but are you also becoming triggered by this experience? Because when we are very aware that our dog is incredibly anxious about something, or even fearful, because I think there is a slight difference between anxious and fearful obviously being a bit more extreme, perhaps. Let's take the classic example of a dog that's very scared when you're out and about. Maybe they're scared of strangers or something. And if you've gone for a walk every single day for the last year, and every single day your dog has seen a person and really been frightened, whether that's hiding behind your legs frightened, or screaming at the end of their lead frightened, you're going to start leaving your house and you're going to start scanning, just like your dog is, and you're going to be tense, your shoulders are going to be up, you're going to be aware. And then when you potentially see that trigger first, because you're higher up usually than your dog is, you start to think, oh gosh, here we go. And of course that people always say, oh my gosh, it's me, I'm passing my anxiety down the lead towards my dog. And I say, well, please don't blame yourself, because it's very natural that you've had this traumatic, for want of a better word, experience frequently. So you're going to be more aware and more alert. And you and your dog are now experiencing this together. So in a sense, it's a negative thing, but it can be helpful, because it allows us to have a bit of an understanding of what that dog is going through. Because often when we are looking at another dog that's maybe behaving badly, we think, oh my goodness, or our perception of what others might think of us is they think, oh, that dog's out of control, what a badly behaved dog, they need some training. When actually that dog's just saying, I can't cope, I really can't cope right now. And so us having that joint experience with them, it gives us an understanding of what they might be going through, but it's also not very nice for us either. So I think our role as professionals is to really provide that emotional support for that person, as well as it is to provide the emotional support for the dog. And more sort of traditional dog training hasn't allowed for that at all. I don't think. I think it has just been, here is your list of training exercises, please work your way through them. And if you get to the end and you don't see an improvement, you need to go do some more. You need to just repeat it, or you need to do, you're not doing it right. And there's just so much blame. And I just don't think that's helpful, really.
I think there's so much there of what you said there, because I think this is the thing for me about when I talk about connecting through the emotional experience, because the caregivers have one, the dog has one, and it's understanding both ends of the leash, really, as Janet Finley says, and this is definitely about how we try and get those best outcomes, because giving people a training plan, that's okay, but that can sometimes be something that the actual caregiver can struggle to do, you know, going out at certain times or going to certain places or doing certain things that actually they end up getting stressed about, they end up getting anxious about before they're doing it. And putting together a support plan that takes into consideration the caregiver's care and support needs as well as the dog is really important. And I think a lot of people, especially if you've got a dog who struggles in that to kind of process the social environment, you end up doing the same thing. And you can end up seeing threats that aren't actually there yourself. And I think trying to give good tools to the caregiver about how they can be mindful of that and do a better threat evaluation themselves, and actually just take a moment and think, oh, actually, that dog's going to be okay, we're going to be okay. That can be really helpful as part of the process.
Definitely, definitely. And I think using whatever you can to give yourself a little bit of space to be able to breathe and process, because when you're in the moment, you can't think rationally unless you are very practiced in what it is that you want to do to tackle that situation. When we are having a trauma response, however strong that might be, it's not the rational brain that's working. It is literally our nervous system is saying you're at threat of death. Our brain can't tell the difference. So the reaction that we're having inside our body and everything that we're doing as a result of that, whether that's our heart's beating very, very quickly or our palms are getting very sweaty, it's our body preparing to get the heck out of there or to defend ourselves in some way. And our dog's having the same response down there because they're a mammal as well. So that's where your rational thinking brain is almost shut off for the most part. So you'll often hear sort of trainers and behaviourists say, get distance, get distance. And that's often paired with get distance and then do a training technique. Whereas for me, I just say, get as much distance as you possibly can to give yourself a second to breathe. If your rational brain then kicks in and you're able to do a bit of distraction or a bit of whatever you're doing with your dog to help them feel better, fantastic. But even if you just get that second to breathe in and breathe out, that's a really, really good thing. And I can possibly share a technique, if that's all right, that you can do. So there's quite a lot of research into the involvement of the vagus nerve when it comes to trauma. And that's a nerve that's kind of responsible, sort of runs down here, for our automatic processes in our body. So breathing, for example. So when you're asleep, you're still breathing, even though you're not conscious and you're not doing it. And all the time I'm breathing now, even though I'm not thinking about it. Although it's that thing, isn't it? When you start thinking about it, become very aware of it. But a really simple exercise you can do if you've just come in from a really traumatic walk, it's been really quite unpleasant. You can just pop your hands behind your neck, no pressure, you're just sort of supporting your neck there. And you just look up to the left-hand corner for about 30 seconds or until you feel the desire to yawn or to open your mouth. And I always yawn within about 3 seconds, probably because I'm permanently tired. And then you can repeat it on the other side. So you're just looking up to the corner, not moving your head, but just your eyes. And then what you'll find is that the mobility of your neck is usually much better. So it's much looser and you start to feel a little bit calmer. So often people will give the recommendation of doing kind of breathing exercises. And that can be helpful for some people, but if you're very stressed, it can be actually quite hard to check your breathing and to focus on a breathing exercise. Whereas something like that, where you're just moving your eyes, can be a little bit more helpful. So yeah, that might be something that people can try if they want to.
Great technique there, and I think you can always look up a lot of these things online as well. There's quite a lot of really good things on YouTube for kind of things to try and get that kind of parasympathetic system working a little bit as well. How you do breathing. Grisha Stewart does a couple of great breathing exercises that she shared for free online as well.
Yeah.
And this is the thing I think we've got to be mindful of, especially when I want us to come on specifically onto trauma in a mo and kind of unpack some of that. But I think the more that we can support caregivers to understand their dog's care and support needs, the more it actually puts a bit of a mirror onto their own. And actually, it makes it easier to give them permission to do less or sometimes to do nothing. And I think to dive in there with a training plan is almost doing the opposite sometimes, which is you've got to do this, you need to do that. And quite often at the beginning of the process, I use the term relief a lot because I think it's really important. I think it's one of the most important terms in the psychology of behavior, really, when we think about relief. Who doesn't want relief, right? And the caregivers probably want it a lot. And when they start thinking in those terms, they can find it easier to do some of the management stuff, to avoid certain places, to maybe not go out for a walk every day.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost like giving ourselves permission to do that, because often people will have tried an awful lot before they come to you or I. They'll have done all the Googling, they'll have tried all these different techniques that they've seen, and it hasn't worked, obviously, for a lot of cases. And so people are almost tapped out with training sometimes. So to be given permission to just say, do what you need to do to keep you and your dog safe, because that's the key, isn't it, when it comes to trauma. When you are feeling traumatized, you don't feel safe. Your world is unsafe. And so maybe you feel safe in the house, maybe the dog feels safe at home, but the second you open that front door and you step out onto the pavement, suddenly it's a big, scary world, and potentially for you as well. So yeah, whatever you can do to help yourself to feel more safe and your dog as well, that's the most important thing, I think.
And that's why these discussions are so important. I've had a lot of people get in touch about how hearing these kind of discussions has shifted them away from a more task-oriented view, which is I need to stop my dog barking, my dog got to stop my dog pulling, or whatever it is, to more of that care-oriented approach, including for themselves, actually. And again, it's inviting people or giving people permission, I guess, to make their world as small as it needs to be in order to try and find that safety. And for us to check in all the time, in the same way we look at the dog in front of us today, because Rover could be different today as it was yesterday because of all sorts of changes. We have to do the same with our clients, I think, and just be making sure we're checking in to make sure they're feeling comfortable with what they're doing, and making sure that they feel they have a safe, open and candid relationship with us so we can have those discussions.
Yeah, definitely. That's so important, because I'll give you an example that happens quite often when I meet someone for the first time. And this is usually a local face-to-face interaction as opposed to online, because most people that I work with digitally have found me through things they've seen me do. So they're a bit more aware of my ethos, I suppose. But sometimes people that I meet locally, they might have just been recommended or they found me on Google or something. And so I'll have the first session with the dog, and I'll come through the front door maybe, and I'll just say, just do what you would normally do. And they'll say to the dog, sit down, bed, like quite firmly. And then they sort of look at me like, is that right? And I'm like, no, like that's not what I expect. But often people think that they expect the dog behaviorist or trainer to want you to be firm and to have boundaries and all these things. And I say, is that what you're normally like? And often they laugh and say, oh no, he comes on the sofa, is that okay? And I'm like, absolutely. My dog sleeps in my bed with me under the covers. So please don't change yourself. So yeah, that honesty is so important. And I think if you, as quickly as you can, if you can show that you are very human and drop in some of those things about what you do with your dogs, it's such a relief, like you say, to people. They're like, big exhale, okay, I can be a bit more honest with this person. So yeah, really, really important for sure.
And I had somebody ask me a little while ago about what can I do to really reinforce to the owner that to leave them something that's really reinforcing for them to want to be able to engage in the process. And my answer actually was, don't worry about doing anything other than helping them to feel heard. Because ultimately that is the most important thing for the caregiver at the start of the process, is they want to be heard, and they want to be able to talk about things. And also we have to be mindful about allowing somebody to speak in the language and vocabulary that they have to start the process, which invariably will have words that might make us think things like discipline or dominance or obedience. I had a lady recently that I spoke to who used a lot of those terms, and when we unpacked that together as we worked through the process, what she actually was talking about was she felt she had to keep her dog safe. She wanted to keep her dog safe. That's what that meant to her. So I think it's important that we don't challenge a lot of that stuff initially, and invite people to, I call it supported awareness, that they go through that process and start feeling differently about their relationship with the dog in those contexts, and also what their dog's trying to communicate.
Yeah, because otherwise you just have all these blocks in the way, don't you? If you've got all these stories that you're telling yourself, oh, the dog trainer is probably judging me because my dog just went and sat. I had a dog the other day, a massive Dalmatian, who climbed on the sofa behind my back, tried to put his paws on my shoulder, and she was mortified, this lady, and I was like, you can get down maybe, but it's not the end of the world, and can we kind of laugh about it a little bit? So yeah, the more of those like figurative blocks you can smash out of the way, the better. And something that we always talk about in human psychology is the idea of safe uncertainty as a concept. And I think that is the whole of what we are doing when we're working with dogs and people. So we're saying we're creating a container of safety. You can trust me as someone to help guide you, as someone you can offload onto, as someone you can say, I've done none of my homework because I'm completely demoralized, please help me. You can use me as that person. But once we've got that trust built up, I want to be the person that says, just dip your toe into that little bit of uncertainty there. We're going to try and go for a walk today, even though you haven't been for 6 months. If it all goes wrong, it all goes wrong. But we're just going to try. Because I think what happens is we can go too far the other way. So if we think, okay, I want to keep this dog's world totally safe, I'm never going to have anyone to my house for the next 10 years. I'm never going to take him further than the garden. That can almost make your life incredibly difficult and create actually anxiety for you and more for the dog potentially. So we want to manage the situation. We want to do the best we can to create that safe container, but then we also need someone with us to say, come on, let's just do a little bit of positive risk taking and then we'll evaluate and see where we are. I think that's really important, and that gets missed a lot sometimes, I think.
And it's important to have that acknowledgement at the start, that kind of thing, like, you know, if it all goes wrong, it all goes wrong, to frame it already before you start. Yeah. And this kind of notion of, let's just see what the environment throws at us. Let's just see how we deal with this. Let's just see how we cope today. Because you're right, because quite often the dog's actually sometimes able to get into a place that they can self-regulate a little bit better, but the caregivers aren't yet. So we have to recognize almost like two streams of kind of progress, isn't it? We have to kind of marry the two. Yeah. Ace. So let's talk about trauma then, Holly. Let's talk about trauma. So you wanted to kind of differentiate trauma so into kind of two parts. Take us through that a little bit.
Okay, so for me, trauma is a massive topic, and you could have a million strands that go off it. But I suppose there's two kind of ways of looking at it for me, which I find helpful when I'm trying to describe it to people. So there's something that we could term a traumatic event, and then there's actually the experience of trauma. And I think they're two very different things. So a traumatic event could be anything, and I think often we think of trauma as like a big car accident or a gang fight, or someone's been at war, like we were saying before we came on air, or something really intense. And of course all of those things are traumatic and could have huge reactions from people. There is absolutely no getting away from that. The other thing is, though, that trauma doesn't always have to be very big events. It can be lots and lots of small events, or it could just be one thing, because the way that I experience a car accident could be very different from the way that you do, Andy. And there's so much that goes into that. So there's the prior experiences that we've had before. So have we had an accident in the past? Possibly. There's our level of resilience when it comes to the effect that these things have on us. And that comes down to the support that we have around us. Do I have someone to talk to if I want to? do I have someone that's saying, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me, when I'm like, I don't want to talk to you? So it's so individual. So there's that traumatic event potentially, and then there's the experience of trauma, and the experience is just so incredibly individual. So I think where we've got a little bit of confusion recently, I think since social media has absolutely exploded during the pandemic and continues to be a huge part of loads of our lives, you get these kind of like 7-second clips on Instagram Reels or TikTok, or even a longer form kind of Facebook post or something. And someone might be talking about trauma, let's say. And if you read that in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, and it doesn't fit with your experience, you think, oh, well, it can't be trauma then. It very well could be. It's just that that person is very far removed from what you're experiencing. Does that make sense in terms of the differences between the two?
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to kind of separate the two, because something we could class as a trauma event, as you say, might not be necessarily traumatic for that individual, and that's why it's also very different. And I think what we've got to recognize is some events, some of those bigger events especially, are likely to be very difficult for that individual to process. But we're all individually the kind of the sum of all those experiences, all those things that we've done in the past. And even you know, a lot of people who have events that happen in adulthood, a lot of the foundational stuff for that is stuff that happened when they were at school, for example. Their sense of self, their ability to communicate need, all these kind of things. And then you could have an event later that triggers something for them. That's very much my story with my own trauma from when I was younger. And I think it's really helpful to separate the two. And also quite often we tend to hear of trauma a lot, social media, the news, about people who experience big events. And that can diminish people's own connection to their own trauma, because you know, who am I to complain because I haven't been in a battlefield, I haven't been in an airplane crash or whatever it is.
Yeah, and it's the sort of labeling that we put on it. So a classic example is if you have a rehome dog, or a rescue dog as we often call them in the UK, so a dog that's had a previous home or multiple previous homes. Lots of dogs come into the UK from Romania, where they've been street dogs, or Greece, or places like that. And there's often this assumption that they will be a traumatized dog because they've had a previous home. They may well not have any trauma. They may have had a wonderful previous home and it just didn't work out for whatever reason, or the person passed away, or they just weren't able to stay there. So when we think about it that way, it's quite positive, because you would think this dog has come from a background, there must be trauma. Well, actually, that street dog could be incredibly resilient. They could be a fantastic problem solver because they've had to be. And actually, maybe they've had quite a nice life up until now. It might be even better on your sofa, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't always mean that there's trauma there. You can also flip that on its head. So just because a dog has been with you since 8 weeks old and you've done your absolute best to provide this wonderful life for this dog, still something can go wrong, and it's often out of our control. And that's where we feel really bad, because we had this idea in our head of this dream dog. We did everything we could to get it, and we still haven't quite attained that that standard. Again, it's not your fault. Most often it's just, that's what happens sometimes. So it's then thinking about what we do to try and recreate a place of safety for that dog, as we were saying before, rather than just thinking, oh, well, I've messed it all up, I have to do better on the next one, which I think a lot of people go to sometimes.
A few things just unpacking that a little bit then, because it's really interesting what you say, especially this difference between a dog that has, you know, we can presume trauma, I think, with some of these dogs with those backgrounds, but that doesn't mean that they're now traumatized by situations. What we do know is that trauma, and I think I always kind of presume trauma anyway, because I think even with us humans, there are some within the human psychology community who make an assumption that we've all experienced trauma. but actually that just informs how we perceive things, and it just adds to those filters that we take information through, and quite often they're not necessarily life limiting, kind of experience limiting. It's just part of that emotional experience that we all have as individuals. And I think this comes back to this thing about doing really good observations when we first meet a dog, to get an idea about what it is that might be influencing their ability to process the social landscape or process things around them, and find out more from them first before we start thinking about what supportive plans we're going to put in place. Because I think we can hide some trauma away under training, because the dogs can start to attach or associate to certain things we're asking them to do. And this thing about being present, we talked about this off air, I know, about dogs can end up engaging in activities but not necessarily being present in that moment as such, because of trauma. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of. And I think also with puppies, we're learning more and more now about the young adolescent brain, and how Mother Nature's designed that brain to be able to pick up on things through environmental, experimental learning, especially to learn better self-regulation as we get older. And we're learning more about the potential friction with some of the structured education that we've had as a bit of a bias as a community, about getting dogs to do certain amount of obedience and that kind of thing.
Yes, definitely. And I think what you're saying there is really important about what trauma can look like, or what traumatized experiences can look like, I suppose, because just thinking about people initially, you might have that image in your head of someone having a panic attack when they've been triggered, crying in the corner of the room, rocking side to side. You might think with a dog, if you went to a shelter or a rescue centre, of that dog in the corner with their head down, looking very sorry for themselves, no response to humans talking to them, touching them, that kind of thing. And that can be what it looks like, but it can also look like getting up and going to Tesco and doing your shop and being triggered by something you see and feeling awful inside, and sometimes not even really being aware of why you feel like that. Often we're not aware of our triggers. It's not always something very obvious, and feeling really terrible for the rest of the day, but telling no one and sort of just going about your business. And the same for a dog. So they may see, I don't know, let's say the classic example people always go to, I think, is my dog was attacked by another dog. And of course, that can be highly traumatizing for some dogs. So let's take that as an example. Maybe that's something people can relate to, perhaps. So say when your dog was younger, they were attacked, for want of a better word, by another dog. Lots of loud noises, maybe a bite or something like that. And then from then on, whenever they've seen I don't know, Springer Spaniel, because that was the dog that was involved, they are wary of them, which would make a lot of sense to me. Makes sense. And that's the thing, trauma responses make sense for the most part. It's when they get very blown up out of proportion that they don't make as much sense to the outside observer, but to that person or that animal, it makes a heck of a lot of sense. You're trying to protect yourself. So they see that Springer Spaniel, they have that internal response, but as you say, they've been trained by the human to ignore. So leave it. We keep on walking, but all those emotions are swirling inside that dog and their brain, and that's got to find some form of release. Now, a healthy release could be that when you get to the next bit of field, you let your dog off and they run and run and run, and it comes out and it's like, almost shedding it. And I'm not a runner. Oh God, no, I hate running. But I can tell you, on a couple of occasions, just a couple in my life, I think the main one I remember is splitting up with a partner. I left the house, forgot the keys actually, and I ran for about 45 minutes until I literally couldn't breathe. But the act of doing that was so cathartic. It was like this big release of all these difficult emotions. So I think sometimes for some dogs, something like that could release. But for others, that sort of running might look a lot more frantic. It might have that tail tucked under, ears back. What we often look at as the zoomies as something quite fun actually can be a stress response in a lot of dogs. So again, it's just you really understanding what is the function of that for that animal? Do they look like they're actually feeling much better after they've done that, or is that just help me, help me, help me, I'm really stressed? So yeah, those emotions have got to go somewhere. Either they stay inside, they become part of a toxic stress pattern where the animal keeps getting more and more stressed at more and more things. They perhaps come out in other ways, bit of whining, bit of barking on the way home in the car, or you find healthy ways together to express those difficult emotions, and then we sort of start to reset ourselves a little bit. So yeah, I think there's a lot to it, and as always it comes down to the individual, which is the tricky bit, because if we could have a recipe that we could all use, it'd all be solved. It would be amazing.
And I think that was the trap potentially that as a community, as a dog training community, we kind of fell into a little bit. Where, you know, the notion of train more, you know, we'll get that compliance from the dog.
Yeah.
And for dogs who have more complex care and support needs, it doesn't take a huge leap to think about being a dog who's trying to find relief, who's trying to process things differently, but is unable to again and again and again, and having to kind of connect to whatever it is we're asking them through training. And when we had Dr. Robert Faulkner-Taylor in our last conversation online, and he was talking about the importance of mood state, and especially that more depressive mood state. And I think we can factor into that sometimes. There's a great saying, as you know, in human psychology, which is emotions will always find a way out. And sometimes when caregivers are seeing a situation or a behavior that seems very almost idiopathic or out of the blue, it can be that outlet for something else, actually, where the dog can't express need or express itself or find that relief.
Yeah. And if you think about how complex this is in us, how multifaceted we are as people, and as you were saying earlier about the link with childhood, which, much as a lot of us don't like to admit it, and I didn't like to admit it for many years, probably 10 years at least, I've nothing to do with that. It is, and there can be positive and negative links there, but there will be. It's about how you view the world, isn't it? And that's a huge part of trauma as well. It's how you're viewing your world, both internally and externally. Is it a safe place to be, as I was saying before? And as people, it's very, very difficult for us to understand the links. Even if you're incredibly self-aware, maybe you've done a ton of therapy, you know your patterns, you know how you respond to certain things. So I'll give a personal example for me. I find it very difficult if anyone were to give me like the silent treatment. So let's say I've had an argument with someone and they just don't talk to me for a couple of days. Now, it doesn't happen very often. I'm not massively argumentative, but it has happened. Now, that's what my mum used to do. So my mum and I lived, it was just the two of us. And if we'd had a row, she would be silent for 3 days. And at the time, I don't really remember how I felt so much then, but I know that that's why now I understand it. It just riles me and I think, I need to find a way to get you to say something. And I'm very aware of that, but I still find it hard to break myself out of that pattern. Now, the layer down from that is someone who isn't aware that that's their pattern. So they're really suffering and struggling, and also struggling because they aren't aware of it. And then the layer down from that is perhaps where our dogs sit, where they don't, as far as we're aware, have that level of cognitive appraisal of what's going on in terms of understanding emotional patterns and things like that. They don't have the awareness, but they have all the feelings. So then it's our role to actually step in and to help them with those feelings. And so we've just been doing a focus dog challenge where I work at the moment online. And a lot of what I like to do with people is to get dogs moving. So it's very, very true for people as it is for dogs, that when you've got lots of emotions, like I was just saying about going for a run, if you are static, it's very hard to shift them. And often when we think about getting focus from our dogs, so let's say our dog's really stressed out and we think, I just need to get eye contact, then I can support them, they need to look at me. And a lot of more traditional training will then say, right, so if you've got a reactive dog that's barking at a person on the other side of the street, get them to sit or to watch me or to hand touch, get some kind of looking and focus. Whereas I kind of feel like I want the opposite. Let's get moving. I don't care if you look at me or not. If you do, bonus. That means that you want to look at me, but actually let's just get on the move. So yeah, anything that you can do, and it could be anything at all, to just get movement going. So if I'm having a stressful day, and you know, when you're just looking at something over and over again and you can't see a solution, you're like, yeah, no, this has gone wrong. Just get up and run around the room, do some star jumps, play with the dog, dance with the dog, sit back down, and then it's like, okay, I still don't have the solution, but I feel mildly better. So yeah, if we can do that with our dogs, I think that's quite helpful too, getting that movement in there.
I think getting, I'm guessing what you're kind of describing there is this notion of getting stuck, where we just kind of get stuck, and anything that can release that, especially kind of physically. If we look at trauma then, for you, what does trauma look like with dogs? What are we, when you're doing those initial observations, when you're doing those, you're looking to kind of communicate back to the caregiver about what you think might be part of that dog's emotional truth. What are the things you look for, and how do you communicate that? So
I think there are a huge number. So for me, I tend to look at like clusters of behaviours or non-behaviours. So you might have a dog that is showing you a lot with their body. So maybe they were trotting along quite nicely, and then we've seen, and some dogs are very helpful because they have huge bodily changes. So you see something very obvious, like the tail goes from here to right under, or the ears that are normally upright go back. And that's the key. It's what's normal for the dog, and then the change. Because if you go on Google and type stressed body signals, you'll see a whole list of things, and all of them are usually pretty accurate, like whale eye or licking of the lips and things like that. But not every dog will show you all of those. And even if they do, it can be so subtle. So part of that observation is really, I like to see a dog in their most comfortable state to start with. So often people will say to me, oh, okay, well, I've got an issue with recall. So is it okay if we meet down the park and you can help me with recall? And I'm like, well, no, not really, because I need to see your dog feeling really comfortable and loose and relaxed first. So I've got a picture. And then I'm not going to take you straight to the really triggering situation. I don't need to see that, but we can maybe go just a step out of the comfort zone and just see what is the minor change, and then we can step straight back in. So that's what I'm looking at. What are those minor little changes for that dog? Or it could be the dog, the difference in the communication between the person and the dog. So the dog is maybe very happy to communicate with their human, and communication could be looking into the eyes, it could be being close to the person, it could be being on a relaxed lead, it could be playing, being able to play, being able to take food, and then suddenly one of those things stops and you're like, right, so what was it that just happened in the last 5 seconds that let me know something was going wrong here? Some dogs, you've got very obvious situations, and I always think it's easier when there's something very obvious. So my dog is frightened of women, or my dog is frightened of children, and you can really manage the environment to support that dog and do little dips in and out, like I was saying before. When you've got a dog that's showing real stress reactions to a lot of the world, that becomes much more challenging for the dog and for the person. And sometimes we do have to have that conversation. Is this the right home for this dog? And that is really hard to have with people. And at first it was something I shied away from. But I think sometimes people want to have that conversation because they're thinking it. And the answer may be yes and it may be no, but it's important to have that conversation as well, I think.
Yeah, they're always difficult conversations to have, as you say, and it's not fair on the dog sometimes, but it's also not fair on the caregiver, because you know, this notion of having that dog's square peg forced into that environmental round hole, it's a big ask sometimes. And there's just, especially with some of the dogs who have certain backgrounds or might be genetically wired to do certain things, especially when we think of some of the breed specific stuff, there's again, it's not the caregiver's fault, because there's just lack of really good information there to help people's awareness. I think that's important. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting you said, I love what you said there about seeing dogs away from triggers and then that kind of thing, because that's a really important part that I really want people to think about, especially professionals. If you've got a dog who struggles with other dogs, for example, or navigating that social environment with other dogs, you need to see the dog without other dogs around initially, to see them and see how they move and see how they process. And I find a lot of dogs who that I see where we're presuming trauma and the dog might be struggling to engage with the environment or struggling, some of those big picture things. Quite often you can see it as you work with that dog, that part of the issue, for example, is that the dog has kind of learned that they can't move in a way that they need to feel safe, for example. I had a dog, going back a little while, that we worked out through the observations that what that dog really needed to do was to be able to shift left. He had a real big thing about shifting left, which when they're on a lead is very difficult, especially because the caregiver had gone down the normal route of the dog must always stay on the right side, on the same side. Actually, then when we started setting these things up, that dog got instant relief by shifting left. Just little things like that. And that must be quite traumatic, really, for a dog when you think about it. Like, I need to do that to feel safe. That's my thing, and I can't do it. So now my options to feel safe are limited. Even being able to communicate what they need sometimes. I worked with a Romanian rescue dog going back a while, who actually the barking was a big part of that relief safety response. It just got very big over time because there were other aspects of being able to orientate that dog needed. So we're too quick, aren't we, sometimes, to jump on certain behaviors and look for a zero sum of that behavior without recognizing that it's more of a drift away from that behavior and looking for changes in intensity, frequency, and recovery more than just the arbitrary yes, no of behavior, binary behavior.
Definitely. And if you can try and find an example with the person of a time where they've had to work hard on something for themselves, so something they felt very nervous about doing, maybe it's giving presentations or sending that email, and how much time they spent procrastinating doing that thing because they really didn't want to, and trying to kind of explain that in relation to what's happening with the dog, that can be quite helpful as well, I think, just to have that shift. And another thing that's really important for me is consent from the dog. So just because you had a plan to do your desensitization training Monday at 10, if I'm walking out of the front door and my dog is giving me a very clear sign that they don't want to go out right now, they do not feel good, and it's not a moment where I feel that it's safe to push that dog a little bit, then I need to listen to that. Now, if it's happening every single day, maybe I need to get back in touch with my behaviourist and rethink the plan. But actually, that consent is really important, because what we want to do is support the dog to feel better. It's not about training, it's about supporting the dog to recover. So if I said to you today, I don't know, an hour ago, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous about talking on your Facebook Live, Andy, I feel really worried about it. And you said, pull yourself together, get a grip. I'd probably be like, okay, I wish I hadn't shared that with you. I don't feel any better, and B, I don't feel supported by you to keep working with you, actually not at all. Now, in another situation, let's say I just hired a personal trainer, I personally might say, I need you to kick me up the arse because I'm going to be lazy. So when I say I don't want to do it, you shout at me. That's two different things. From one person, I want them to say, come on, get a grip. From the other person, I want them to say, you'll be fine, you know what you're doing. I've given the person that I want to give me a kick up the bum consent to give me a kick up the bum, and that is the difference. We can't expect our dogs to do that, so in words anyway, so we need to look again for those minor changes. He was absolutely fine to go and do some training yesterday, but today he's looking a bit off, so I'm going to leave it. And I think that's important.
This comes back to really good observations, doesn't it? Because that's a really good example there, those two very similar kind of scenarios, but very different in context. And because there are some dogs who actively seek direction, and we start to see those little patterns, and we're like, right, this particular dog needs an extra element of micromanagement, maybe. Whereas the other dogs who are like, hang on, just hold off a minute, I need time here myself to deal with this myself. And it's just building upon the two. And if we're unavailable to the one who wants that direction, that's just going to add more to that stress. And if we're trying to micromanage and ask loads of cues to the dog who wants to be left alone,
Mm-hmm.
we're doing the same thing. So it is looking at those things, but also those two things there could actually be the same dog, but in different contexts, about what they need at different times. And that's why really good supportive kind of input, intervention, if you like, has to be constantly reassessed and reevaluated.
Definitely, that's so true. And I usually give the example of like taste in food. So thinking about food rewards for people and for dogs, just because your dog is a Labrador and would eat anything, much as my Labrador would, it doesn't mean that he still doesn't have preferences. And what was his preference on Monday may not be his preference today. So I'd like to do quite a lot of choice check-ins with my dog. So before we do anything that might involve a food reward, I've got ostrich sticks in this hand and I've got turkey here. What do you fancy? And it's the same when it comes to thinking about any kind of, I hate this phrase, but behaviour modification, helping a dog to feel more secure is how I like to think about it, but changing behaviour, I suppose, ultimately. It's, are you able to do this today? No, right, okay, well, maybe we can do this instead. And then next time I'll check in with you again. Are you able to do this today? Okay, we are, great, let's do that. And then that dog can change their mind. So you might get partway down the street and maybe it's been going well, and then suddenly they're like, no, I can't do it anymore. And we go back. And that's what we saw in people all the time when I worked in secure services. People would psych themselves up. Okay, right, we're going to do this scary thing. And for some people, that could be coming out of your bedroom. So you're sharing the ward with, in my case, it was intensive care ward, so 11 other men. And you're terrified of those 11 other men. And actually, you've been hidden in your room for the last 2 weeks. And it could be, right, okay, I'm going to do it with a member of staff. I'm going to take a few steps towards the dining room. Yeah, no, bring my food to my room, please. I can't do it. But just recognizing those 4 steps was a win. That was fantastic. And I think it's about having the tribe of people around, like your fantastic group, that can share in that. Because your sister or your best mate, even if though they know that it's important to you, they may not get it. They may not see quite how significant it was that your dog took a few steps out of the front gate. They're like, well, I just saw a dog on Britain's Got Talent walk across a tightrope, so what are you talking about? So it's about having those other people around you who can say, yeah, oh, that's amazing, well done. And that's what motivates you to keep going, isn't it, at the end of the day?
I think that's such a really important and powerful point. There's a saying which is, let the little wins give the biggest grins.
Yeah,
I love that. And I think, and we have to celebrate that with our clients and really get them to embrace those little wins, especially when you've got a dog who is recovering from whatever, and he's going through, he's very sensitive to things in the environment, or might be easily triggered by various different things. One of my clients recently sent me an email, and it was amazing because it was just loads of smiley faces, loads of exclamation marks, and then there was just a couple of words that said, he came and sat next to me in the lounge tonight for 5 minutes, and then loads of smiles. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because they recognize the beauty in that and the power in that for that dog to come and be available just for those 5 minutes, when in fact the dog had spent probably the last month not coming into that space.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it sounds so corny, but they are the things that make all the difference. If you can support a family to be able to get to that point with their dog, it's amazing. So yeah, definitely so lovely to get emails like that.
And to support our clients to this notion about being available to the emotional truth of another. It's actually really hard, because if we're elevated ourselves in any way, we become less available to the stuff around us, even excitement and that kind of thing. And in those moments, it's allowing ourselves, because inside we're like, oh my God, but that kind of response could be enough to make the dog think, hang on, I don't feel comfortable again now. So we have to really encourage our clients with those types of dogs, who a lot of them aren't kind of dogs who've come in from abroad often, or dogs who have had a particularly difficult process through the rescue process, maybe, or whatever it is, and they're coming to a new environment and they're finding it all a bit much. And I think one thing, actually, just to think about that, actually, one thing that we both do, I know, early on in that process, is giving permission for the caregiver not to do so much, because although it might feel a little bit sad and upsetting to see that dog just in the corner, staying out the way, sometimes they need that. They're going through their own decompression. They're having that time to suss stuff out. And the more pressure we put on without meaning to, the harder it can be then for that dog to think. So like, for example, that client, that's exactly that scenario. And that's the first time the dog had chosen to come in for that 5 minutes and then went off again. But next time it might be 6 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, until eventually the dog can feel safe in that environment.
Yeah, and it's about having the strength yourself to be able to be an advocate for that dog, even though society sees them as a bad dog. Because what I struggled with my very first rehome dog was that outside of the house, he looked aggressive. He would bark and scream at everything that he saw. And everyone would be like, that's a bull breed, that's a dangerous dog. They never saw how incredibly wonderful he was at home, how cuddly he was, how loving he was and still is. And I would find that so hard because they only ever saw the naughty dog. And however much I tried to say, no, he's wonderful, you could be like, yeah, I'm sure he is.
But you know, we both, because obviously I've got a therapy background like you with humans, and we could have the same conversations with caregivers for children who struggle, with people who have partners who struggle. You know, it's not, so that kind of caregiver burden is there both ways, because you know, you could have a loved one who you know, who is kind and loving, but struggles in different environments, and people make judgments about that person then, or that child. And it's the same with dogs. And I genuinely think, you know, when we're holding that leash, we may as well be holding the hand of that vulnerable child. There's no difference really. And it's just recognizing that the dog we know is the dog we know. That is the dog that other people see as our dog not coping.
Exactly. That's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah.
So I can't believe it, Holly, that hour's flown by. But before we leave it, anything else you want to share with us that we haven't covered, that you really want to put across regarding working with dogs who you know, who are maybe in a traumatic state or who have experienced trauma?
Yeah, maybe I'll just expand a little bit on what we were just talking about kind of the tiny little steps that you might need to take sometimes. And I do quite a lot of what I call threshold work. So this could be the threshold between your house and the garden. This could be the threshold between you, like you were just saying, sitting in the living room watching TV and the dog being just outside the room there. And for me, I like to do quite a lot of sitting on the ground. So if you're physically able to do so, or getting as low as you possibly can, it's not about getting on the ground so you can encourage the dog to come over to you. It's not about that at all. But I would actually sit kind of side on, just super relaxed and just being with the animal. So you're just allowed to be in a similar space with them. So if they want to sit outside of the room, no problem. You might even start slightly out of their eye line if that's what they're more comfortable with. But it's just working out at what point can you see relaxed body language from that dog? And then that's the point that you stick at for as long as you need to. Because we as people are so eager. And it comes from a nice place. It comes from, oh, look, he came slightly closer. Let me see if I can get him even closer. No. So what I always say to people, and this is the same even if you're just doing sort of general training with any dog, if you find yourself thinking just one more exercise or just 1 centimetre closer, that if you think that thought, that's the point that you need to stop, because you've already won. And come back in at that point again. So yeah, I would really like to think about it in that way.
And also when we think about the consent, embracing the no's, so as in the no, not the nose, but because you know, I find with dogs, when I meet them, looking at those signals, for example, when they're like, no, I don't want to approach, no, I don't want to engage with you. If they know they can say no, they're more likely to say yes when they're ready.
Yeah.
And I think it's just embracing that. I think it's very important, and especially with caregivers, because we don't like the no. we're like, especially as a caregiver, like, well, why is my dog saying no to me? Because I love them and I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to give them a great life. And it's just letting them realize that the opportunity for the dog to say no is vital. And if they can feel safe with a no, they're more likely to feel safe with a yes.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. And I had this with my own dog the other day. She's just come into season, and it's only her second one. She hasn't had one for a long time, and I was actually getting a bit worried. But anyway, this week she came into season, and she's not had a huge behavioural change, but she's notably more alert, I would say. And I tried to do something with her. I'm trying to teach her a little trick at the moment, and she started to do it, and then she backed off, lay down, and barked at me. And instead of going, come back here, come in, look, this is what we're doing, I was like, interesting. And I actually said to her, that's interesting, what's that about? And she sort of looked at me. And so I put it away, and I just, like I said, just sat back against the wall. And then after about 2 minutes, she came and she put her head on my lap and I stroked her. What I wanted to do wasn't actually to carry on. That is what I would have wanted to do maybe like 6 years ago. I didn't want to do that, but what I wanted desperately to do was to walk over to her and stroke her and sort of get in her space. But she'd quite clearly removed herself from me and gone and sat over there. So I just thought, I'll just sit here and wait. And then when she came over, I was like, you're right, buddy. And I suspect it was likely hormonal. Who knows? It could well have been something that I did. We'll see. But I'm not going to try and do that again with her until she's feeling better. So yeah, just noticing that. And it happens even to people who work as, you know, professionally with dogs. It's not just people like everyday people, it's people who've trained professionally in this. It still happens to us. So yeah, it's important to listen to it.
That's important, because we've got to make sure that any training we're doing isn't slipping without us meaning to into a more of a coercive act.
Yeah.
And I think all training, it is a request. And I think we ask something and then we wait for the response. And sometimes that response is no, or that response is, I can't. It's very rarely, I think, from my experience, that a dog is, I won't. It's more like I can't because I can't process anymore today, or I'm a bit uncomfortable, or I'm you know, too distracted, or I'm too elevated, of course, because the ability to connect those things in. This has been amazing, Holly, and thank you very much for kind of coming in today, and especially I thought I'd wait till the end to let people know that I'm quite poorly, so it's great to have you and get you to share so much and let me not have to do much, because that's great. And sorry if I sound a bit bunged up, because I am. I've tried not to cough, which is hard, isn't it, when you try not to cough? But I had to let a few out, so sorry about that, everybody. But it's amazing. Holly, where can people find out more about you and your work?
So we have a podcast, which is Letters from Your Dog. Our main website is pawsupdogs.com, and we also have a Facebook group which is called Kindness is Essential, Not Optional Dog Training Support. So you can find us on there as well if you'd like to come check us out.
There's been loads of comments in on the chat today, but maybe if you get time and you want to have a look at those, well, definitely if you could pop those links in or let me have them, Holly, and we can let everybody know. And kind of connected to today's conversation, actually, we've got the wonderful Diane Garrett coming in on Wednesday 7 o'clock. So Diane's book, obviously Stress Release, talks a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier, Holly, about putting decompression and the ability for that kind of parasympathetic system to kind of help regulate first and get that dog to a better space really is very important. And I think that'll fit nicely in with this conversation. Well, it's always a joy, Holly, to speak to you, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and passion with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, especially when you weren't feeling well. Really appreciate it.
That's okay. And thank you, everybody. Say Diane Garrett in the group on Wednesday. Then the following week, we've got Carolina as well, Westland, coming in. The following Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we've got some great guests coming up. So I hope you can join us for those, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye.